Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is the highest-ranking Republican to speak out against Iowa Republican Congressman Steve King for making racially charged comments. McConnell said in a written statement to the Washington Post, quote, "I have no tolerance for such positions, and those who espouse these views are not supporters of American ideals and freedoms. Congressman King's statements are unwelcome and unworthy of his elected position. If he doesn't understand why white supremacy is offensive, he should find another line of work." In an interview with the New York Times published last week, King said, quote, "White nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive?" The next day, King tried to distance himself from those comments, saying in a House floor speech that he's not anti-immigrant. The Congressional Black Caucus is calling for him to be removed from his committee assignments, and one Democratic congressman from Illinois is introducing a resolution to formally censure King. Facing backlash from members of both parties, King dodged questions multiple times today on Capitol Hill.
I don't have any statement to make. I'm on my way to an important meeting.
Are you going to meet with McCarthy right now?
I said all I'm going to say today. I've got some things I must do right now. So
have you been
I'll slow down
informed
and do
of
that
any?
at a later time. I
Have you
don't
been
have any
informed?
worries.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy quickly denounced the comments last week, calling them reckless and wrong. Sunday on Face the Nation, he said, quote, "Action will be taken."
That language has no place in America. That is not the America I know, and it's most definitely not the party of Lincoln.
Should he be punished for it?
I have a scheduled meeting with him on Monday, and I will tell you this. I've watched on the other side that they do not take action when their members say something like this. Action will be taken. I'm having a serious conversation with Congressman Steve King on his future and role in this Republican Party.
What does that mean?
Because as a leader, there is a number of things you'll see that has taken place. But I will not stand back as a leader of this party, believing in this nation that all are created equal, that stands or continues to stand and have any role with us.
Here with me now is Shermichael Singleton. He is a Republican political consultant who has written extensively about race and the GOP. Shermichael, thank you so much for being with us. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the only black senator, Tim Scott, wrote in the Washington Post one of the most high-profile rebukes. I want to read it. He wrote, quote, "When people with opinions similar to King's open their mouths, they damage not only the Republican Party and the conservative brand, but also our nation as a whole," he adds. "Some in our party wonder why Republicans are constantly accused of racism. It is because of our silence when things like this are said." Do you agree with what Senator Scott wrote there?
I agree 100%. I will say before I get into my opinions on the article overall, it is a bit disconcerting that it took the only African-American senator, Republican senator, to write an op-ed to sort of give permission, if you will, to other Republican senators and Republicans in the House to finally come out and denounce Steve King. This isn't new. King has been there, I believe, 15 years. His statements have been relatively consistent throughout the duration of his time in the House, and most Republicans have said much of nothing for the most part.
I want to ask you about the highest profile Republican, the one in the White House. When he was asked about King's statements, he sort of gave a shrug and said, "I haven't been following it." What do you make of that?
I mean, come on. I don't think anyone would believe that, right? And I think that's where the disconnect happens. If you remember back in 2012, after the loss of Mitt Romney, in 2013, the Republican Party produced and published the Growth and Opportunity Project. And in it specifically, maybe a couple hundred pages in, they write exactly that minorities think the Republican Party is a party of old white men and it's racist and does not understand the reality of many people of color in this country. At that point in time, the party under Reince Priebus, who was chief of staff to President Trump, said, "We are going to allocate $20 million to target outreach and mobilize minorities and people of color with a message of conservatism."
Right.
Here we are under Donald Trump, and that message is now lost. Now, when you think about Donald Trump, it's really difficult if minority leader or the minority leader in the House says this is wrong. If the majority leader in the Senate says this is wrong, we need to do something here. But the president, who is now the leader of the party, doesn't say much of anything, then I think it makes it difficult for a lot of people to believe that the party really does view this as a problem that needs to be addressed.
So let's talk about how it should be addressed. We just heard McCarthy saying that there should be actions taken. What sorts of actions would you like to see taken here?
Well, I mean, I think he has to be removed immediately from all of his committee assignments without any negotiation, and he should be censured. Now, the party as a whole cannot force him to resign. He was duly elected by the people of the state and the district that he ran in. But what they can do is say, going forward, you will not receive any support from any Republican-leaning organization in your next election. They can do that effectively and force him to run essentially as an independent or find someone to challenge him.
Right. So I want to ask you about larger sort of ideological concerns. I mean, as we know, there are plenty of people of color in this country who hold conservative political views. I mean, I'm half Latina myself, and there are very many conservative, you know, Catholic Latina families. But as you point out, it often seems as if the Republican Party is not a welcoming place for many conservative people of color. And some would say, well, when there's smoke, sometimes there's fire. I mean, is there, and some conservatives themselves have come out and said, you know, I think that there is an element of racism at the core of the Republican Party right now.
Well, I guess candor would oblige me to say this. If all the worst people who believe the worst things, who exhibit the worst types of behavior, morals, ethics, belong to one party, it makes you wonder why. Why are you attracting these types of folks and not necessarily the other party? They're choosing this party for a reason. And the party hasn't done its due diligence by saying, we don't want you all here. You're not welcomed here. But not just stopping there, actually going into the Hispanic communities, African-American community, where we share a lot of commonalities as far as our cultural beliefs and traditional values. They haven't done that effectively. And so as a result, the party may say we're not the party of racists, but I am almost certain it is fair to say the party certainly dances with folks who are racist.
And seems to turn away many times.
Oh, absolutely.
In the face of it.
Well, they have, and I think what is beginning to happen now, the party is looking at the demographic change in the country. Latinos are the fastest growing. Asian Americans are now starting to grow at an exponential number. African Americans still remain very relevant. The party itself, though, which relies heavily on white men in particular for its viability, is beginning to see those numbers diminish over time. So what does that mean for the electoral competitiveness of the Republican Party? It says that in the long run, you won't be able to compete against those other parties, because there's an old saying that Jack Kemp said, former congressman who was a vice presidential candidate. People don't care how great your policies are if they believe you don't care about them first. And that's the perception of the Republican Party.
But then again, we did just see a president go into office with arguably little to no outreach to communities of color.
That's true. That's true. And that sort of gave to many Republicans, and it was very concerning to me, because that gave to the Republican Party the right to say, well, maybe we don't need outreach that much.
Because
he didn't need it.
There was almost more progress in the Republican Party pre the 2016 election. You saw there was more of an effort in terms of outreach, and it almost stopped after the 2016 election.
Well, it did. They set up sort of diversity camps, if you will, in key strategic battleground states to outreach to African Americans. And literally, once the presidential cycle started and once it became more and more clear that Donald Trump would ultimately be the nominee for the party, almost all of those things stopped, because, again, that wasn't a priority of his campaign. And the party will typically follow the direction of the nominee of the party, because if that person wins, then that person is essentially the leader of the party. And unfortunately, diversity just wasn't important to Donald Trump's candidacy or his campaign, and ultimately his White House. And I think you're seeing the result trickle down throughout the rest of the party.
But going forward, it probably will be, which is why it's so important, wouldn't you agree, that King's statements are addressed?
I don't know if it will be.
You don't know?
But it has to be. I have hope. But as of yet, I haven't seen any hardcore evidence that would lead me to believe otherwise. But if the party is smart and they're thinking long term, you have to change. Otherwise, perhaps we'll go the way of the Whigs.
Right. But you are, you know, a black Republican.
I am.
And you are proud to be so. So
I am.
Is there anything that would ever make you leave the party?
Well, you know, I think with all people at a point in time, I think self-reflection is the highest form of reflection, right? We reflect on everything else around us, but we rarely reflect on ourselves. And at some point, I am going to be forced to ask myself, is everything you're worth fighting for even worth anything if no one's listening? If you're not changing anything, perhaps you're better off maybe being an independent. And that's a legitimate question that I'm consciously asking myself as of late. And right now, I'm hopeful that perhaps there is something worth fighting for. I think people should have the choice to choose between two healthy parties because iron sharpens iron. And I think that intellectual exchange of ideas is what moves the country forward. But if people aren't susceptible to change, if people don't want it, you can't force it upon them.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. And I do know that the Republican Party can't afford to lose members like you. So
Sure.
keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks so much.
Shermichael Singleton, thank you so much for coming to be with us.